I'm really excited about this month's webinar, Hawaiian Anchialine Ecosystem and Fishpond Conservation in the Face of Climate Change. I'll put our schedule in the chat, but we have a series of shorter talks that will take us to somewhere between 3 and 3:30 p.m. Hawaii time. And I'd like to introduce our speakers and a short sentence about so our first talk will be by Dr. Lisa Marrack, who grew up on the island of Hawaii and has worked for 9 years at Kaloko-Honokōhau National Historic Park, surveying anchialine pools and coral reefs. These experiences led to her doctoral work at UC Berkeley and subsequent research. Currently, she is an affiliate researcher with University of Hawaii Hilo and science chair at Santa Catalina School. Her talk will be assessing the response of groundwater-fed anchialine pool ecosystems to sea level rise on the island of Hawaii. Next will be Rebecca Most, who is the Hawaii Island Marine Program Director for the Nature Conservancy, where she supports community-led management strategies to care for and restore marine and coastal habitat. The Nature Conservancy facilitates the Loko network, which provides opportunities for network members to share lessons learned, research innovative techniques to restore habitat, collaborate on workdays to increase our impact, and provide outreach and education to our communities. Her talk is titled Loko Network, Connecting, Restoring, Perpetuating. Next, we have Kaileʻa Annandale and Jackson Letchworth, are employees of the National Park Service at Kaloko-Honokōhau National Historic Park, which was established in 1978 for the preservation, protection, and interpretation of Native Hawaiian, traditional Native Hawaiian activities and culture. Their talk, In the Face of Climate Change, Kiʻo, Anchialine, and Loko Fishpond Ecosystems at Kaloko-Honokōhau National Historic Park. And we'll end with Lehua Kamaka, Kia'i Loko at Kaloko-Honokōhau and Hawaiʻi at Kīholo State Park for Hui Aloha Kīholo. She is a native-born descendant of Kona, caring for the uplands, lowlands, shorelines, the waterways, fish ponds, anchialine pools, and the ocean with all residents, inhabitants, were traditional practices of her ancestors. Lehua continues these traditional practices as a kuleana through Malama. Although I cannot be exactly like them, quote, it is in my DNA to do what I can as a succession to continue living their legacy through me and to pass on these teachings to those who are willing to receive this kuleana that will come after me. And her talk is looking to the teachings of our ancestors as we adapt to climate change at Kīholo, Puʻuwaʻawaʻa. So please join me in welcoming our speakers. And I am going to turn it over to Dr. Lisa Marrack to start us off.
Hi, everybody. So I see from the group that there's a number of people that have been part of this work and we've known for a long time, I've known for a long time, and some new people. For those of you that were at the 5th International Conference on Anchialine Pools in Kona this past November, some of this talk will seem familiar. And this is actually where we first started to, Elliot asked if we could have a presentation, and we wanted to include a lot of the practitioners on the island. So my goal is just to share a little bit of the science that I've been doing along with many partners, and then lead into all the amazing work that all the groups are doing on the Big Island. So part of this work that I'm sharing have been different projects, some at UC Berkeley, some funded by the National Park Service, some funded by NOAA, and I'll just jump into this. So I've been really interested in conservation of anchialine pool ecosystems ever since working at Kaloko-Honokōhau, and became very interested in what the effects of sea level rise would be on these pools. And, okay. So for those of you who don't know what an anchialine pool is or a groundwater-fed ecosystem, Anchialine pools are these pools that are close to the shoreline, but they are not connected overland to the ocean. They're fed by upland fresh groundwater that's flowing in very porous basalt or karst substrate that mixes with the marine lens that's coming in under the island. And these pools are brackish. They're tidally influenced. They go up and down with the tides every day. And they are found worldwide throughout the Pacific Rim, also in the Atlantic. In Hawaii, we actually have a variety of groundwater-fed ecosystems, not just anchialine pools, but wetlands, as well as Hawaiian fish ponds, which I won't be speaking too much about, or I won't be speaking about them at all, but some of the folks later will be speaking about them. I think it's very important to acknowledge that the indigenous people who are Hawaiian have maintained and used these resources for a very long time. The fish ponds, some of them are as old as 800 years on other islands, as well as these anchialine pools have been used for food resources, for water resources, and for important cultural purposes. So really beginning at the park with some of you and also continuing on through the decades, we've surveyed over 500 anchialine pools shown here by the black dots on the Big Island. And one of the things that we found is they can range anywhere from 1 to 27 parts per thousand salinity. They're typically set about 400 meters or closer to shore. And they have a wide range, as you can see, of vegetation around them, microbiomes, and organisms that depend on them. Some of these are incredibly special, endemic, and rare. We have damselflies, a variety of mollusks. We have a variety of anchialine pool shrimp, some of them quite rare. And we also have water birds that depend on some anchialine pools. So I do want to bring your attention to the red shrimp in the upper right corner. Many of you know of these as opaiula. The littlest, the Helocaridina rubra, are our grazing shrimp, and they spend time eating the microbiomes, keeping the algae down. All of these shrimp will move back and forth between the groundwater and these pools, sometimes on a daily basis. And so I think for a lot of us, we want to protect this biodiversity. But we also have a lot of introduced species in these pools. And so from my survey data of over 400 pools, about 4% of pools have tilapia, and about 24% have introduced guppies and mosquito fish. And as with many places around the world, these are voracious introduced predators. In the anchialine pools, they eat the opaiula and other shrimp. And in a survey that we did and subsequent analysis, we found that fish actually had the strongest negative effect on whether we found shrimp or not. So when you have fish, the shrimp aren't there because they're being eaten or they're escaping down into the groundwater. And some of the work that some of you have done have shown that with the Kaselehlies, at least at nighttime, those shrimp will come out and graze. But this can have ramifications on the pools and the algae in them. Just kind of a little example of this little cluster of pools, this pool on the right, it's full of water at all tides, and it has actually guppies and mosquito fish in it. And you don't see the shrimp at all during the day. But in a pool just a few feet away, actually the fish can't survive. It goes dry at low tide, and then the waters come in, the groundwater comes in at higher tides, and the shrimp flood in from that deep groundwater and graze in this pool. So the takeaway is these introduced fish have a big effect on the pool biota. But back to sea level rise, I'm also really interested in how sea level rise will affect these ecosystems. So in Hawaii, we expect about 1/2 to 2 meters of sea level rise by 2100, depending on our emissions. And if we kind of look at this cartoon, we can think about how sea level rise might be affecting some of these anchialine systems and how there might be some synergism between introduced species as well as some pollutants. So if we look at our sea level rise scenario, when we have sea level rise, what happens is the groundwater, which is fresher and sits on top of the marine lands, gets pushed up. It's more buoyant. And so what may happen is we will have connection between pools and the potential for these fish to disperse. We also may have new pools emerge on the landscape where low depressions that didn't get wet previously become wet, and shrimp can use those as habitat. We also may have connection with pollutants such as cesspools, septic tanks. And lastly, if we look here to the left, during big surf events, we may actually have some connection with the anchialine pools themselves. So in the late 2000s, working with the Nature Conservancy with funding from NOAA, we had a goal of developing groundwater flood models that we could use for anchialine habitats to share with managers and planners. And two big questions we had were, where will new pools emerge at these different times in the future? But also, what is the risk of introduced fishes, development, and sewage to these future habitats? And so I'm going to share a little bit of the results with you. One thing that we did was we focused in West Hawaii, so just within this blue box. And there has been some preliminary work in a few other areas, but we're going to be focusing in on this blue box. And kind of one of the takeaways is we came up with some great maps and sort of images showing where flooding happens now and where we're expecting it to occur. And we've have these in an app that you can see the URL here, and I'll give that to you at the end. But the idea is that this visualization of flooding will really help planners, managers moving forward. This is Kīholo Fishpond, some of you know very well. And you can see that this is current flooding with the dark blue. That's what the pool is. You can see that the lighter green is what may flood on a daily basis when we have our high tides. And we have anchialine pools that are kind of set back from shore here that are not connecting overland to the ocean. In 2040, the daily flooding is quite a bit more. The groundwater gets pushed up, we have a lot more flooding, the pond gets larger, and we end up with anchialine pools actually emerging. These are new pools that are in yellow here. You'll note that some of the pools are red. We're going to get to that, but these are identified as those that have some risk from introduced fishes. So I'll get back to this, but I kind of wanted to show you just from our GIS layers and our maps that this resource is something that we created. So in some ways, this is the takeaway, but I wanted to get into the model just a little bit. And I don't have time today to talk in great detail at all about how we created those flood models, but they include a groundwater model, which I'm going to show you, some digital elevation models, local tide gauge data, and then regional sea level scenarios. So I do want to focus a little bit on including groundwater into sea level rise models because it's not always done. Chip Fletcher is doing this quite a bit on Oahu and starting on Maui, but it's really important to incorporate if you live in other areas and you have unconstrained aquifer, which is one that where the marine water is moving into basalt or karst areas. So groundwater is typically higher than sea level because it's buoyant, it's sitting on top of sea level. And every day, as tides go up and down, that water level inland, the groundwater is moving up and down as well. And as sea levels rise, we will see this happen as well. So we're going to incorporate this groundwater level into our sea level rise models. This is incredibly important for our anchialine pool mapping. The way we did this is we incorporated some USGS well data. They had some data from wells and anchialine pools in Kona. We also put in our own loggers. This is what the loggers look like. They're recording depth, and we tied them into centimeter resolution elevation data using these GPS units. And so each of these points is a place that we had a logger for over a year. And then we were able to place them into this model where on the y-axis, we have groundwater height above local mean sea level in meters. And on the y-axis, distance from shore. So 0 would be the shoreline. And you can see each of these dots or triangles would be one of those locations where we had a logger for over a year. And we see that definitely groundwater, as we expected, is higher than sea level. It quickly increases so that as we go inland, you can get 0.5 meter or even more higher than sea level. So this was included in our GIS models and really helped us, I think, to more accurately depict what flooding will be in the future. Now, before I get into the results, I want to just pause. Most of the time when sea level rise models are included in coastal areas, it's really focused on the extreme water levels and storms, erosion. What we're focusing here on is more of that sunny day flooding. This is in Miami City, and we're starting to see more and more flooding just on a daily basis, no big storms. So this is kind of the norm. What used to be dry is becoming wet on a more daily basis. For an ancholine pool, a more normal daily flooding in a place that used to be dry is actually new habitat. So shrimp will come in from the groundwater, and this will develop into an ancholine pool. So we want to start to map these and think about protecting these new pools as well as our existing habitats. Okay, so getting back to this map for Kīholo, again, the yellow are new pools that have emerged on the landscape. They're flooding on a daily basis. And we are going to plan for these. And Becca hopefully will tell us more about how we're doing that. We're thinking about those. But I did want to give you a little bit of summary data instead of just zooming into this one little area, thinking about that whole West Hawaii area. If we take a look at the number of pools overall in that West Hawaii area, and we look at these timestamps through from current times to 2080, you notice that the dashed line are original pools, those that exist today. And you can see that actually over time, some of these will disappear. They're going to start connecting to the ocean and no longer be ancholine pools. And you see that in the picture in the upper right, these little yellow dots are current pools, but in the future, they'll be connecting to the ocean. But you notice that over time, we're actually increasing the total number of ancholine pools as low levels in lava begin to start filling with water, with groundwater. Looking at sort of a regional scale, this is the current coastline from 2018. Each of these coastlines is identical, but you see there's a different year associated with it. And this is a heat map of pool density. So we can see that places that currently have higher pool densities that are, the warmer the color, the more pools there are in that area. So this, for example, is Kaloko area, and the lower my cursor is pointing to. And you can see that that continues to have a real high density of pools in the future. So we can use this for planning purposes. If we think about pools and invasive fishes, what I'm looking at on the map here is each round circle indicates an individual pool that exists today. And red means that actually they have fish in them. Yellow means they don't. On our graph here, you can see that the total number of pools on the y-axis against time, we see that in 2018, about 1/3 of our pools have fishes. And as we go into the future, we will have more pools. We also notice that about 50% of those pools are at risk for having fish. And that's because at a highest tide, at a king tide, fish will be able to disperse from current places to new habitat. And so these sorts of efforts, this is at Kīholo area and down at Puʻuwaʻawaʻa, that school groups, local groups that we're going to hear from today, they're trying to catch these tilapia and other introduced fishes. So the more we protect the current habitat, the better able we're going to move into the future. And one of the exciting things, it's hard to remove these fish, but once they are removed, what's been really exciting is the opaiula, the endemic shrimp, come back very quickly. So this is a pool that Dina Seder removed fish from at Kikahakai State Park, and within 24 hours, the shrimp did come back. Just a couple other things. I'm almost out of time, but we did also look at sewage impacts on pools. This is the same sort of thing you saw before, but this is sewage risk from septic and cesspools. And you can see that in some areas, there is going to be an effect from these high nutrients from these septic and cesspools. And I'm currently working with some people at Hilo and a student looking at this in Kailua Kona and what we can do to kind of plan for that. Finally, I just want to point out that development on our coast is something we really need to think about. This is an inclined pool that you can see a house was built very close to. So there's really no place for this pool to move as sea level rise pushes that groundwater up. And so planning for places in particular where there's high risk, where new pools will emerge in places where either there is development or the county plan is allowing for development in the future, is something we really need to consider. So really we want to think about, if we're looking at an area like this, people might say, oh, it's rock, it's lava. But at some point in the future, this is going to be new habitat. And we want a habitat that doesn't have fish, where we have the native species and where people can continue to use it as they have in the past. This is the URL for our app, and I'm happy to talk more about that and share that with all of you. But what I'm most excited about is to hear from everyone else about all the amazing work that they're doing to perpetuate this resource and our knowledge of it. So there's a lot of you on this list. I want to thank all of you and pass the torch, pass the baton on to Becca. I think we're going to have time for questions at the end. So that's it. Thank you. So I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm just moving my screen so I can share mine. All right. So that was a great presentation, Lisa. Just highlighting a lot of the excellent work of many partners to care for alkaline ecosystems. And I'm really happy to be invited today to share about some of the ways that the partners on Hawaii Island are working together to care for alkaline ecosystems, which regionally we do call those waiʻopai. So I probably will refer to them as waiʻopai throughout this talk. So again, my name is Rebecca Most, and I'm the Hawaii Island Marine Program Director for the Nature Conservancy. And we have a wonderful team on island that has been supporting a group called the Hui Loko Network, which are Hawaii Island pond protectors. And this is a recent logo that we developed for our network. It's meant to be an abstract version of a pond, could be either a loko ia or a waiʻopai, because we care for both. So you can see stylized hands, kind of symbolizing the way we malama these ecosystems together. And the abstract sun is meant to be both the energy that we're putting into caring for these resources, and also the energy that it gives out to us all and enriches our lives as we are the stewards of the waiʻopai on Hawaii Island. So the Hui Loko Network was formed in 2014. And like every great idea, it came together watching sunset in Hana in Maui with some colleagues of mine, David Chai and Pi'i Lahea, who have been caring for these ecosystems for decades. And we were having a beer over sunset at the Hui Malama Loko Ia gathering. And as we watched the sunset on a different island, talking about the places we care for, it was expressed that why are we talking about this on a different island? We should be getting together and coordinating our efforts and sharing what we're doing locally. And so that was the genesis of the Hui Loko Network, was that conversation over a beer. And it has grown since 2014. So we now have, an advanced slide, over 26 organizations in our network. The organizations represent federal agencies like the National Park Service and NOAA, state agencies like the Division of Aquatic Resources and state parks. We have a number of NGOs like the Nature Conservancy, KUA, and also private landowners, cultural practitioners, and researchers. So the idea behind the network, or our mission that we developed, was to continue to preserve and restore local culture and Native Hawaiian ecosystems by providing a space for connection and exchange of ideas, resources, and encouragement amongst pond managers to perpetuate the traditional Hawaiian practice of malama I ko wahi, so to care for these sacred places. And as the network grew, we now encompass most areas of Hawaii Island where these systems are present. It includes fish pond managers and anchoring pool managers. So we have a number of sites on the leeward coast, but we also have sites in Ka'u and Hilo and Puna that are represented amongst the network. And, Lisa was sharing a little bit about the shared challenges. And part of the function of this network is really that we can be communicating together about what we are working on, what are some of the challenges we're facing, and what are some of the solutions to address those challenges. So invasive species like non-native fish, like the tilapia in the top left, or invasive plants like the grasses in the bottom right, are often a shared challenge amongst the network members. But we also have some places that are working on rebuilding the rock walls that help stabilize the ponds, or working on habitat restoration around the ponds. And so understanding these challenges and the work that Lisa was sharing about how sea level rise is going to impact these ecosystems and how can we adapt and make wise decisions now in terms of our efforts to be good stewards, is really something that we spend a lot of time talking about as a network. And the way we do that is we get together quarterly. We have a fish pond coordinator. Her name's Barbara Seidel, and she's in the middle with the green tank top. So she brings us together and organizes our meetings. And it's just an opportunity for us to share what we're working on and the opportunities to work together. We rotate sites amongst the network so that we get to visit the places that we're protecting and learn from each practitioner about the history and the culture of that area and any restoration or outreach or education efforts that they're doing. And so these conversations are really rich, and it really helps us innovate and come up with new ideas together. And if we tried something and it didn't work, that's just as valuable as knowing what did work. And so really that exchange of ideas, bringing in researchers to share any science that's been done, has been a really great way for us to stay in communication and collaborate. A really important part of that is being grounded in the function of these ecosystems and how they supported the Hawaiian community. So a lot of our efforts are sharing about how these ecosystems, how Waiʻopai and Loko Ia were really instrumental in supporting the society here in Hawaii. For the Waiʻopai, they were the drinking water sources, they were the bathing water sources, they were the irrigation sources for coastal crops. So, on the leeward coast of Hawaii Island, without the healthy Waiʻopai, people would not have been able to survive in these arid climates. And similarly for Loko Ia, these were huge food security resources for the community here. And so A lot of our work is understanding the history and the practices that took place and making sure that our efforts to steward them are honoring and perpetuating those practices. So the group does a lot with local school groups, visitors, to teach them about these ecosystems. We've developed brochures, we've developed educational curriculum that's place-based, that can be used by the different network members with the groups that come. We deeply believe that the more people that understand about these ecosystems and love them and care will just help with ensuring that we can perpetuate and care for them into the future. And another way that I really enjoy how the Hui Loko network comes together is through shared work days. So we really operate under the spirit of Lau Lima, that many hands make light work. So whether it's removing invasive plants around a fish pond or removing sediment that has moved into these ecosystems or rebuilding rock walls, the network really thrives when we get dirty, get in the ponds, clean them up. It's some of my favorite memories working with the group. So I'll just end with this last picture, which was a recent Hui Malama Loko Ia gathering on Kauai, where team members from the Hui Loko network met with statewide practitioners and were cleaning and opening up this waiʻopai or this punavai, a freshwater spring next to their fish pond. The sheer manpower and skills of this group is quite impressive. And, you know, all the research that Lisa was sharing and all the work that the National Park Service has been doing to restore these ecosystems really comes down to people that love their place and are actively working hard to ensure that they're as healthy as possible. And this will build the resilience for these ecosystems into the future to be able to withstand the effects of climate change and allow for that habitat to be able to migrate and for the native species to continue to thrive. So yeah, I encourage you to get involved with Waiʻopai or a Loko Ia near you. There's many volunteer work days, many opportunities. And I will go ahead and put my email in the chat. So if you'd like to learn more about the Hui Loko network or how to get involved with any practitioners near you, I can help connect you. And I'm going to be passing it over to my colleagues at Kaloko-Honokōhau, who will be sharing about the work they're doing at the National Park. Thank you, guys.
Mahalo, Becca. Give me one moment here, share my screen. Can everyone see my screen? I believe so.
We got it.
All right, awesome. Well, hello, everyone. I know Elliot previously introduced me. But once again, my name is Jackson Letchworth, and I'm a biologist with the National Park Service, working at Kaloko-Honokōhau National Historical Park. And the title of our presentation today is In the Face of Climate Change, Kiʻo and Loko Ia Ecosystems at Kaloko-Honokōhau National Historical Park. And happy to share with you all some of the work we're doing here in the park around these unique ecosystems and our efforts to make these systems more resilient in the face of climate change. I'm sure many may be familiar with the park, but for those who are not, I'll share a little background information. So Kaloko-Honokōhau is located in West Hawaii. We're nestled just north of Kailua town and to the south of the airport. We're a fairly small park, roughly 1,200 acres, but uniquely close to half of our park encompasses the marine waters as well. And we have extensive cultural and natural resources, hundreds of identified archaeological features, as well as over 10 endangered species. We also have 2 Hawaiian fish ponds of differing types and 1 fish trap found in the park. We're also a pretty young park, founded in 1978, but we have a very unique and special mission, and that is to preserve, interpret, and perpetuate tradition, Hawaiian culture, and knowledge. So here on the leeward side of Hawaii Island, the park setting is very arid. The average rainfall in the park around 20 inches or so. And our significant resources, namely our groundwater dependent ecosystems, depend on fresh groundwater inputs for their continued health. So therefore, the groundwater quantity as well as quality are paramount issues for us here in the park. And this is a neat thermal imagery map showing groundwater discharges into the park. And you can see the blue color, which is cooler fresh water entering the park, is mostly located around the local i'a or the fish ponds. And you can see just how much fresh water is entering the park. And it was estimated around 3 million gallons a day several decades ago. So still, there's some more work to be done. It'd be interesting to see how much is entering the park now. But much of our focus is on those groundwater inputs, and of course, keeping a keen eye on all the development that is happening and planned to be happening around the park. Now I'll turn it over to Kaileʻa to share some more about our incline pool efforts.
Aloha, everyone. I'm Kaileʻa. I am a biological technician here, and I do a lot of monitoring of our aquatic environments, including our incline pool monitoring. There are more than 200 identified and mapped incline pools within our park boundaries. A select few are monitored quarterly, but we do our best to try to get to all of them every 5 years or so to measure water parameters, substrate, vegetation, and kind of like the presence and absence of species within the pools. And out of those pools, each pool is highly unique depending on the location within the park, whether it's near a wetland or in the ʻaʻa field. And our salinity can range anywhere from 7 all the way to 29 parts per thousand. So we monitor, manage, and restore the pools in the park to maintain as healthy as we can an incline pool habitat for our native species. Many of these species Lisa had already shown, but within the park, we have our opaiula, the Halicardinia rubra, and the Metabateas lohena, as you see in the right-hand corner. We also have the endangered orange-black Hawaiian damselfly up there on the right, in several of our pools. And we've had 2 sightings of the endangered Proceras hawaiiana in the park, and have also seen some rare species like the white snail and a white amphipod. So kind of to reiterate what Lisa was saying, and here's some kind of real life examples of some climate change and effects of sea level rise. We mainly see these during the king tide events, really high tide events. We're starting to see more wet spots pop up in the pool, in the ʻaʻa. So just a little bit of wet coming up, which could eventually be a new incline pool one day. Figuring out when do we start to monitor it and determine when that's an incline pool is one of the questions that we ask ourselves. We're seeing more pools connecting, more flooded areas in areas that we had not seen flooded before on our trails, and some overtopping or brief surface connections to the ocean. As you can see there, the sand going into the incline pool after one of our king tides. And again, like Lisa had mentioned, one of our largest threats or major threats to these pools is invasive non-native fish and guppies. Fish are, well, in 2016, we had about 19% of our incline pools have had fish. And the fish disrupts a lot of the ecological balance of the pool systems, alters the behavior of the native shrimp, and threatens the survival of the damselflies, as these fish can eat the naiads or larval stages of the damselflies. And another concern with the sea level rise is the spread of these fishes as the pools begin to connect and during these flood events. We've had several of our anchialine pools in the back of our fish pond which has tilapia in it. And these anchialine pools have been invaded by the tilapia during these high tide or flood events. Additionally, about half of our pools go dry at low tide, and at high tide, the opai come back. So it leaves an area where fish are not able to survive, and there becomes a refuge for these opai. So as sea level rise, the number of these pools that go dry will decrease, and increasing this risk of potential fish invasion. As you can see in these pictures, the top right is a pool that had guppies in it. And after our fish removal efforts, you could see the opai returning in hundreds of thousands. And that's again within just a few days of the fish removal. Now I'll turn it back to Jackson. He's going to go over a little bit more of our fish pond and anchialine pool restoration and some of these fish removal efforts that we've been doing in the park.
All right, mahalo Kaileʻa. So we have numerous ongoing restoration projects throughout the park. And here's a beautiful aerial you can see of Aimakapa'a Fish Pond, which is found in the middle of the park. And currently we're actively restoring both Aimakapa'a Fish Pond and Kaloko Fish Pond, which you can see at the top of the photo, way off in the distance along our northern boundary. And how we decide which areas we focus our restoration efforts on in the park is mostly based off two things. And one of those is the groundwater dependent ecosystems. And so the fish ponds and the anchialine pools. And then the second is areas of high cultural significance. So archaeological features or historic properties found throughout the park that can be negatively impacted by the non-native invasive, mostly woody vegetation. And the way we do that is we use an IPM approach. I'm sure many are familiar, but it's just an acronym, Integrated Pest Management. And it provides a suite of different tools that you can use to restore areas. And so here are a few more photos of the Loko ia found in the park. On the top, you can see Kaloko. Kaloko is a Loko kuapaʻa style pond, meaning there's a man-made wall which separates the natural shallow water embayment or pond from the ocean. And on the bottom is Aimakapa'a. And Aimakapa'a is a Loko puʻuwaʻawaʻa style pond, meaning there's a naturally formed sand berm which separates the pond from the ocean. And both of these Loko ia are designated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as core wetland habitat. And that's for the recovery of two endangered endemic water birds, which you can see there. The Io on the left, which is the Hawaiian stilt, and the Alii keʻo on the right, which is the Hawaiian coot. Here's a great photo of one of our photo points at Aimakapa'a Fish Pond. So this is from 2016. This was right as restoration efforts were kind of getting off the ground. So right in the beginning, you can see the pond was full of pickleweed. That's that light colored invasive succulent, as well as kiave trees and some milo growing in the pond. And then several months later, less than a year later, most of the pickleweed we removed, and then a lot of the native seed bank was really healthy. So you can see some native wetlands plants recolonizing. Those are two native sedges you can see there. It's makaloa in the foreground, and then kaluha just behind it. And so some other large efforts are dedicated here to the removal of kiave trees in the park. For those of you in West Hawaii, then you may have seen the helicopter flying around. If you see that, that's what we're doing. But we put a lot of effort into that. And once again, those removal efforts mainly focus in areas where the trees are impacting those groundwater dependent ecosystems and or those archaeological features. So you can see here, you can't see the pond, but this is actually on the south shoreline of Aimakapa'a Fish Pond. And all those trees are now removed and the shoreline's been reestablished. So it's been shown that Prosopis species can negatively impact local hydrology. There's 2 different species of prosopis found in Hawaii, only one on the Big Island, but they have been implicated in lowering the groundwater tables here in Hawaii. Kiawe, it's also a legume, so it's a nitrogen fixer, and it has the potential to alter nitrogen dynamics of these particular ecosystems, namely Lokoʻia, which are nitrogen limited, and they can be negatively impacted by increased inputs of nitrogen from the kiawe trees. So removal of kiawe in the park helps increase the resiliency of these ecosystems, especially in the face of climate change and different sea level rise scenarios that we're currently facing. We also have restoration efforts underway at numerous anchialine pools. So here you can see the picture on the left prior to removal of the vegetation. It was being completely choked out by woody vegetation like Christmasberry, sourbush, Plukia species. And then the picture on the right shows the pool after vegetation was removed. So some of our restoration actions obviously include the removal of non-native vegetation, but also the removal of invasive fish, which has been mentioned several times today, which prey upon native opaiula or shrimp, but they also prey upon naiads, which are deposited into pools by the orange-black Hawaiian damselfly. One important component of the anchialine pool restoration here and in other places in West Hawaii is completed prior to fish removal is dye tracing. So what this involves is using an environmentally safe fluorescent xanthine tracer dyes and applying the dye to specific pools. And then after some time has passed, using activated carbon samplers, supplemented with water grab samplers, so taking your own water samples, to map the groundwater pathways. And so the results of dye tracing helps us identify definitive flow times and also the pathways of the dye to adjacent pools, ponds, as well as the ocean. And so last year, using data collected from some of our dye tracing projects, we conducted a pilot project to eradicate invasive fish from 11 different anchialine pool complexes in the park. And we utilized rotenone, which is a commercial pesticide, which is created in the lab. But we also utilized ahu'u, which you may be familiar with, but it's a Polynesian introduced plant that was historically used by Hawaiians to kill and stun fish. And the results were really great. We were able to actually eradicate fish from the majority of the pools. And in some of those, we've now seen opaiula come back to pools in which they had never been observed before. So pretty neat. Much more work and information gathering is needed, but the results are really promising and hopefully can be extrapolated to other pools or ponds for future fish removal efforts. And so in these photos, the photo on the left there, that is some staff members processing ahu'u, so pounding it before it's applied to the pool. And then on the right there, it's after the application of ahu'u, and the deceased fish that are killed have to be collected at different time intervals. So that's staff there looking for fish and trying to scoop them out. Here's an aerial photo of Kaloko Fish Pond, really great photo. You can see the pond and then separated by the kuapaʻa and the marine waters on the left. We had hoped that members of Hui Kaloko-Honokōhau would be able to join us today and share some of their awesome work, but unfortunately they weren't able to join, partly because they are at Kaloko. They were there earlier today leading a school group, some elementary school kids from Kaloko-Honokōhau, so pretty awesome. So they weren't able to join, but they started collaborating with the park in 2015. And this group has been actively participating and spearheading many of the restoration efforts at Kaloko Fish Pond, including frequent kilo, observing, gaining knowledge to learn more about the waters of the local i'a, the fish and limu. And so this knowledge gained has been a tremendous help, helping to inform us about ecosystem health and needs, and while also helping to guide rehabilitation efforts at the pond. And so we're very grateful to them. Mahalo nui to the hui. And here's some great photos of members of the hui, members of the community during some of our volunteer community work days. I believe Elliot will share their website in the chat if he hasn't already, if anyone is interested in learning more about their group and some of their efforts, or even joining a community work day. So I'll leave it at that now, guys. Mahalo. And if you folks have any questions, definitely invite you to throw it into the chat. And at this time, I believe I will pass it off to Lehua. Mahalo.
So Lehua has a family emergency, and she is someone that I've worked with for many years, over a decade, at Kaloko-Honokōhau and the surrounding Waiōpai. So during this presentation, she's been texting me and sent me her presentation, and she asked for me to speak on her behalf, and I will do my best. Her voice is very beautiful, and her lived experience caring for these ecosystems is one that I can't hope to replicate. But there were some sentiments that she asked me to share with the group to kind of close out our presentations, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So if you'll bear with me, I'm very much doing this last minute. Let me share my screen and try to see if I can get the slideshow to work that she just sent me. So Lehua Kamaka, she is what we call the Kia'i Loko for Hui Aloha Kīholo. She's a lineal descendant from North Kona. And in this picture, you see two Waiōpai. The name of this area is called Waialepi. On the right is Waialepi, and then on the left is Waialepi Iki. And the child sitting or standing in front of the pond is Haveo, who is her niece and who has joined Lehua on many work days and doing research and restoration activities at these ancholine pools that are located in Kīholo State Park. I was chatting with Lehua a few weeks ago as we were preparing for this webinar. She was asking me, like, what should she share? Like, she's not a scientist, she's not a researcher, she's not a manager, but the way she identifies herself is a Kia'i Loko, so a cultural practitioner that has taken on the kuleana to be a steward for these ecosystems, a voice for the Opai'ula and the native species that thrive in these ecosystems, and to perpetuate the traditional practices by actively caring for them. So as she was thinking about climate change and we were chatting, she did her own research and was thinking about what adaptation to climate change looks like, and was reflecting on all the work of folks Mauka to Makai to build resilient ecosystems by caring for the forest, removing invasive species, making sure there's room for native species to thrive and have space to survive and reproduce. And she researched the word to adapt. Like, what does it really mean for us to adapt to climate change? And so adaptation is becoming adjusted to new conditions. And she, in the conversation I had with her a few weeks, one thing that really stood out to me was we were reflecting on how adaptation, especially here in Hawaii, is not a new thing. There are so many stories in our mo'olelo. There are so many examples in the past and present of how we are a very resilient society and have been a very resilient society for generations. And as natural disasters have come, whether it be hurricanes, lava flows, tsunamis, before climate change was the reality that we're facing now, the Hawaiian people have faced change rapidly and had to adapt from those. There's a story at Kīholo where there was a massive fish pond that was about 600 acres that was built by King Kamehameha on the north end, Kaloko-Honokōhau, and a lava flow came and consumed most of that fish pond. and the community had to adapt. And so there's these lessons over time of the community coming together, caring for one another, caring for the ecosystems, and adapting to the changing conditions. And so we can really look to the past to guide our efforts and how we adapt to climate change. And that was a theme in our discussion as we were reflecting on her work at Kīholo State Park. And so, for climate change, of course, we're referring to that long-term change in temperatures and weather patterns caused by human activities, especially the burning of fossil fuels. And we are seeing climate change every day when we're working alongside each other at Kīholo. We're seeing it here. This is an example from the Fishpond of the Alii, and on extreme tides, on king tides, it has been shocking to us to see the water moving into these habitats, water that for the families of the place, we've never seen water in the areas that we've seen in the last few years. And as we move more Mauka into the Waiʻopai habitats, what we're noticing is those ancholine pools that were distinct different pools like Waiʻalipi and Waiʻalipi Iki are now merging and becoming one pool. And we are seeing new pools forming in the lava fields in those low elevation areas. So kind of bringing us back to the beginning where Lisa Marrack was talking about how we're going to adapt, use the information from the projections of what sea level rise is going to be. There's many activities that I've been working alongside Lehua at the Fishpond and in the Waiʻopai, where we're watching where the water is moving and we're asking ourselves, like, what can we do now to make wise decisions for the future so that all this hard work, all the like chainsawing kiawe and rebuilding rock walls and planting native trees, we want that to last. We want that work to serve the next generation and be the forest for the keiki. And so these are some pictures of recent high tides where we are seeing flooding in areas that are usually land around Kīholo. And the way we've kind of absorbed the maps that Lisa was sharing and watched it firsthand at the Fishpond and the Waiʻopai, there's definitely a time of mourning. There's definitely a time of grief as we watch the water move in. But we know we can't fight the ocean, and we know we need to adapt with it. And so some of the decisions we're making in terms of where we're replanting the native forest is we're using those maps that Lisa was sharing and looking at where, out to the year 2080, what areas will still be dry land. And so let's focus our restoration efforts there. Let's remove the invasive species and plant the native forest in the areas that we know will continue to be native forest for the next generation. And then in the work in the ancholine pools, when it comes to removing invasive fish, let's target those areas that have the most impact. Like which pools, there's a lot of pool complexes that have one pool has the invasive fish, but then there's all this really excellent habitat around it. And so if we can target that one pool with the invasive fish that can, potentially infect all the others, that gives us the most bang for the buck. It feels like the wisest decision of where we're focusing our efforts, strategizing and prioritizing our efforts so that it will have lasting benefit. So here's an example of that ancholine pool I was just describing behind the fish pond of Kīholo, and you can see a fence that Hui Aloha Kīholo installed a number of years ago to keep the ungulates out and replant with native species. They have lolu and hala and makaloa in this ancholine pool. But at this high tide, you can see how that ancholine pool is extending all the way out and crossing our driveway, crossing our road. So as we think about how that pool is growing, we want to make sure that we're growing with it and that we're allowing it the space it needs to thrive. Some more pictures that Lehua shared about Waiʻalipi. I literally haven't seen this presentation yet, so I'm doing this on the fly. But these are the beautiful pictures of Waiʻalipi at different tide states. And the work she's been doing there is, again, removing invasive plants, removing invasive fish, cleaning out the debris from the pond to make space for the opaiula to be able to move freely through the pond and graze the algae. And the pond looks like so much better over the years that I've been watching and supporting that work. Lehua is just such a thoughtful steward of that place, and I really think we can learn a lot from her efforts there. And this was the last slide. It's of Haweo, the same child that was in the first presentation. It's been really beautiful to watch Haweo growing up, being a kia'i in training. And, this concept of looking to the teachings of our ancestors as we adapt to a changing climate at Kīholo. is one that we really want to instill with Hawaiʻi. And you know, she knows what to do on a work day. She shows up and she grabs the net and she's catching more tilapia than any of us. And so this is, you know, really what gives me hope is that she's adapting, she's seeing the work, and she's engaged in it. And I think that there's so much to be learned by involving the community, the volunteers, and the students in this work, because they're really the ones that are going to carry it forward. So thank you guys for allowing me to share on Lehua's behalf, and I'll turn it back to Elliot for questions from the group.
Mahalo nui to all our speakers. Thank you so much. Becca, do you mind maybe stop screen sharing? Oh, I think it's on my end. I got to change my view to gallery view. And then
yeah, I think I stopped. So.
Yep. Thank you so much. That was so amazing to see all of the amazing efforts helping build resilience for these incredible places. We have a number of questions, so I'd encourage everyone to turn on your video, and I will start with a few in the chat, and then we can open it up if you want to turn off your mic as well. Okay, so we've got our first question for Lisa. Does the graph of introduced fish risk alongside the new pools include the anticipated tidal variation, pools drying you mentioned in the beginning?
Yeah, so when we determined what was a new pool, what we determined would be a new pool would be that in terms of frequency of flooding, that it would be flooding on a daily basis, because that's actually when we see shrimp coming into other pools, like that one I showed you. You know, it's dry part of the day, the water comes in, the shrimp come in. So that's kind of how we were identifying what would be a new pool. In terms of fish risk, the way we define that was if there was connection at a higher tide, like an extreme tide, and fish could get in. But we did not incorporate that idea that, okay, maybe those fish couldn't survive. And I think that's a great thing. That's great, because actually that might reduce those numbers of pools that are infected by fish at that time. I think thinking though, in terms of error, there's a little bit of error here with elevations. You know, 2040, there might be a certain number of pools infected, but then a few years later, there's enough water to keep those. So no, we did not include that it might go dry at a low tide. Yeah, we weren't that precise with our predictions.
For the next question, as the new pools move up into places where there is development, is there any modeling for how it might affect homes or I guess the built environment? How can one plan for potential new ponds in your backyard? Is there community outreach that can help protect those areas and incentivize protection of those areas?
Yeah, so when we were looking at pools emerging on the landscape, we did not include places that were already built on, like paved areas or built areas. We did spend a lot of time talking to the planners in Hilo, the county planners, and they're extremely open to the idea of trying to incorporate this into planning in the future. But because we didn't have data for the entire island, it was a little hard for them to even think about putting it into the laws. However, they were sharing this with homeowners or people that might build in the future. So I think that just letting people know if they're building. Luckily, the Big Island, a lot of that coastline isn't developed, although there are developments in some places. So I think where most of the pools were popping up that we saw is our actually open space at this point. So we're hoping that new development doesn't come in and cover what could be future pools. I like where you're going with that, though.
I have a question from Stephen Miller, although I wanted to invite you to ask that question out loud. So I don't quite understand it if you're still here. Okay, well, feel free to speak up. We'll move on. Is there any evidence suggesting the upslope industrial area is impacting water quality in the park pools? I don't know if someone from Kaloko-Honokōhau has anything on that.
Will you repeat that, Elliot?
Sure. Is there any evidence suggesting that the upslope industrial area above the park is impacting water quality at the park pools?
Yeah, it's a great question. We actually have a position here at the park solely dedicated to keeping an eye on proposed developments around the park and water usage. A lot of that involves not just the developments, but new wells, proposed wells, experimental wells, and water withdrawals. And so a lot of the public data is on water withdrawals, so more related to water quantity as opposed to quality. And so I can't speak on if it doesn't appear that the pools are negatively affected now by any nutrient inputs that we know of. There is definitely some water quality monitoring that's occurring in park waters, but not from park staff monitoring some nutrient inputs. So yet to be determined, but we're keeping an eye on it. It's definitely of utmost concern. Right now, just Mako of the park, there's a proposed development of 5,000 new homes, a hospital, and 2 schools, I believe. All will require water. And so point source and non-point source pollution is on our mind. But at the moment, really what we know is affecting them in the present time is more related to the quantity. And so we're trying to ensure that the quantity, the freshwater, the baseline that we had pre-development continues to flow. So I'm not sure if that quite answers your question, but we don't see any negative effects just yet that I know of.
One of the things I'll add in is there's a little study that I was doing with some folks just at the south end of the park. And there is a sewage treatment plant that puts its water into, basically it's semi-treated water into the ground, and it runs out into the harbor area, out onto the reef, and through some ponds in the south end. And it seems like when the ʻopaiʻula are there, they're very actively grazing. They keep the algae down. But if there's fish in those pools, there's a lot more sediment, a lot more algae than other places. So I think it's sort of like the coral reef situation, where if you take away the grazing fish and you add a lot of nutrients, you get a lot of algae growth. And so.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Lisa. And also, just to add on to that, folks may have seen in the news, but a group recently brought up a lawsuit against, I guess, against the county because of Kealakekee wastewater treatment injecting the sewage into the ocean, potentially in violation of the Clean Water Act, because they do not have an MPDS permit, which is required if you discharge into navigable waters. So you may see more about that in the news in the future.
I have a question. I'm not sure who it's for, from Jesse Adams. Do you folks use the whole plant or just the fruit of TEP-PUR? I'm not sure what species that is. Maybe if Jesse's here.
Yeah, I can take that. That's the Tephrosia. So that's the ahu'u or auhu'u. It's got a couple different pronunciations. It's a Polynesian introduced plant that I briefly mentioned that we used to attempt to eradicate invasive fish from one of our pools. And yes, we did use the whole plant. So the chemical found in the laboratory-made pesticide rotenone is CF2 legumine, and it's the same exact chemical that's found in the ahu'u plant. It's found in different concentrations throughout the plant, but it is found throughout the whole plant. So we used the entire plant, leaves, stems, and processed the whole thing, many plants, filled up trash bags full of it, and then applied it to the water to eradicate the fish. And it was effective. The one caveat or potential caveat is you don't know the concentration you're adding to the system when you use ahu'u. You can estimate it, but there's various concentrations found throughout the plant. And so it's very difficult to know the quantity of plant you need for a particular volume of pool. Whereas if you use the rotenone, you can know exactly what the amount of chemical you're applying to the pool, and then theoretically you know your exact volume too. So, but we did use the whole plant. Yeah.
I have a question from Anne Farahi. What methods are being used at YLAP for fish removal? She mentions at one point, folks had tried introducing a predator fish, and she was wondering if that was successful. All right, maybe I'll move on to the next one then. To what extent do changes in salinity that must accompany changes in sea level alter the species present? That's a tough one.
I can share very quickly about the endangered endemic water birds. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has set / estimated salinity thresholds for the endangered water birds. I believe they say it's somewhere between 12 to 16 parts per thousand. We obviously see water birds throughout the state, and salinities outside that range. But potentially in the future, sea level rise and saltwater inundation into these local and other systems, we know these pools as they exist now become salty, more salty. So viable habitat for the water birds will decline potentially, but I will say it will decline in the current areas they exist. But as we know with Lisa's models, the pools and the local and the ponds, they're gonna migrate. So hopefully the species will migrate with them as well.
Yeah, this is Nelson Harson. That was my question. Can you hear me? So yeah, maybe this is for Lisa. I was just wondering, if there's a gradient in salinity as you move inland from the ocean with ankling pools, is there a gradient in which species are present, even in algae, cyanobacteria, invertebrates? And as sea level rise changes, are you pushing that transition inland? Or, I mean, I'm a freshwater ecologist, so I'm sort of interested from the other direction, where these freshwater organisms enter.
That's a great question, and I didn't attempt to include salinity in the models, but it's really interesting. Like at Kaloko, there's definitely a gradient from the shore inland. When I was there, but things have changed. So Kaileʻa or Jackson or Becca, correct me if I'm wrong. I remember the freshest pools being the most inland at about 8 parts per thousand, but up, north, they can be 1 to 2 parts per thousand. I don't remember seeing a gradient, although after being at the International Ankline Pool Symposium and some of our friends from the Atlantic, they're way better at identifying some of the species that we're not focused on. There's some micro species that we're not really paying attention to. So that would be really interesting. But I will say that it seems like the greatest diversity of shrimp and some of the rare shrimp are actually at the south end of the island, Manuka, where the pools tend to be in the 20s. you know, parts per thousand where they're saltier. So I think it's an area for a lot of investigating. You know, the opai ula have been shown to be able to survive at least into up to 50 parts per thousand, but I don't know if they're able to complete their whole life cycle in that. So it would be really interesting to dig into that.
Thanks.
I want to thank everyone as well for who've been answering questions in the chat. That's super helpful. So I've got one more, and then I might have missed some, so we can open it up after that. Are the golf course nutrients, I'm assuming that's fertilizer, at Kohana'iki impacting the Anchialine ponds there? There appears to be lots of algae in these ponds, and I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on this area, since we don't have any speakers working. I'm not sure if there are any folks from Hui Loko present right now who are working there.
I could just chime in, you know, not speaking on behalf of Kohana'iki, but in general, the combination of invasive fish and elevated nutrients from anthropogenic sources does seem to cause algae blooms in the ponds. I do know that Kohana'iki has a dedicated crew that are working really hard to control the algae blooms in their ponds and monitor their resources, and have done a lot of successful restoration efforts around that area. But in general, reducing anthropogenic nutrient sources and removing the invasive fish seem to be the two strategies that can be the most helpful to ensure the habitat's healthy for native species to thrive.
Thanks, Becca. Are there any other questions from the audience you want to ask out loud? I also want to provide an opportunity for any of our speakers, if they want to make a plug for volunteers or future positions, any help that is needed, you would want to let our audience know about, or any final concluding remarks.
I have a quick question. This is Lisa Marrack. I know that there's folks here who are working in other parts of the island, like Megan and Namaka and other folks. And I'm just curious if you're starting to see places flood that you haven't seen before, or pools connect that you haven't seen connect before. Just curious about that.
This is KT Cannon-Eager of Friends of Liliu Okalani Gardens. Waihonu is the 5-acre pond at the heart of the park. And yes, we are seeing pathways impacted, more soggy areas in low-lying spots showing up. Yes is the answer. We're seeing an impact.
So yeah, in Ka'u we are as well, both at Kapanako in Kiʻo, kind of like Ka'alualu side, and Waiohinu. Well, before you get to Kamilo, there are now pretty regular flood events in the coastal, like on the coastal trail that used to be just lava, and some of which are not just king tide events, it's just higher high tide events, and they're flooding, and some of them have opai ula. So we are seeing a change.
I've got maybe one quick question to finish this off then for the speakers. Anyone who wants to take it. How are you thinking about and dealing with uncertainty and how things are going to change? Is it paralyzing? Are you having fruitful conversations? Are you coming up with alternative plans or strategies? Any or all of those? Any thoughts?
I can speak on, in our work at Kīholo, it's not being afraid to pause and watch and listen and learn from the place. But but also, use the information we have to adapt and continue to be nimble and flexible as new information comes in. I think there is value in really like taking the time to thoughtfully plan, not just willy-nilly, like, do things wherever you can just because you can. I really value the perspectives of the lineal descendants that have that generational knowledge of how these systems have changed, how they've relied upon them, and how they've adapted to the changes. And I really want to honor what Lehua shared in her presentation, which is looking to the past to guide our future. And so I don't think it needs to be paralyzing. There's definitely moments where my eyes get big when I think about the future, but we just have to like keep moving forward thoughtfully with perseverance, but also the patience to do things wisely. And that's usually the approach that I recommend.
And I think when we first started doing this, we would look at these pools that we care about and think, okay, these are going to be gone. Why are we putting all this effort into this? And sort of to just emphasize what Becca is saying and all the work that Jackson and Kaileʻa and others are doing is continuing to protect these resources will allow people to know about them, to people to participate in them, to help the species that are there and the cultural practices that are there. So that as new pools emerge, we can continue that and species can continue that.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in really quickly too. It's almost, you're kind of hitting on the RAD framework, Elliot. And I would kind of say we're doing all of the above, a little resisting, a little accepting, and a little directing. And so we're doing it all. Resist, accept, and direct. And so what it's doing is, in some ways, I would say the scenarios that we're facing almost are forcing us, which is a good thing, to prioritize more. All of these places are important and all of the pools are important, but it's forcing us to prioritize where we put our efforts and resources. And so, for example, in our project writing or we're seeking funds, we're thinking about those things. And an upcoming project next year is removing kiawe trees just south of Aimakapab, several hundred yards away, where it's not really wet now, but there are trees out in the ʻaʻa, so they're tapping into the groundwater. So yeah, it's guiding a lot of our future project work.
Well, we're just about at time, and I want to ask everyone as well to thank our speakers for the amazing presentations, the amazing work that's happening, helping build the resilience of these incredibly important, ecologically, culturally valuable areas to climate change. So a huge thank you for that. I'll get the video posted in the next couple of weeks so that you guys can check that out and share it. And I put in a link to our website where you can find that a minute ago. But thank you again for joining us.